Well, hi and welcome. It's great to be back with you. We're looking today at session 7, or at least chapter 7 in your book, and we're actually going to be covering chapter 7 and chapter 8 in this session and in the next session. And we're looking at arguments, which I think is really the core of the critical thinking process. We've talked about reason and emotion. We've talked about various aspects of language and communication and many of the dimensions that go into effective critical thinking. But when you really get down to it, understanding an argument, what type of argument it is, whether it's inductive or deductive, and then being able to diagram that argument is a very powerful tool in analyzing and thinking critically. And so for this session, we're going to look briefly at inductive arguments. There's a great deal of material in your textbook on this. I'll just highlight some of the key aspects of an inductive argument. So in an inductive argument, unlike a deductive argument, the conclusion is probably true, and it follows from the premises that are in the argument. As a result, inductive arguments are either stronger or weaker. There's actually a scale that you look at on an inductive argument, and you determine where on that scale that inductive argument falls. Is it stronger, or is it weaker, or is it somewhere in between that? And so when we look at inductive arguments, we need to understand that they're not really true or false as much as they are either strong or weak. In both inductive and deductive arguments, we have certain words that are what we call indicator words. And these words include words such as probably, most likely, chances are, it is reasonable to expect or to suppose, and it seems probable that. When you see those words, you know that you're dealing with an inductive argument. Of course, there is a catch to that, in that not all inductive arguments contain indicator words. So there are three kinds of inductive arguments: generalizations, and then there are analogies, and then there are causal arguments. Generalizations, analogies, and causal arguments. And a generalization runs something like this: most corgis are good watchdogs. My dog Mindy is a corgi. Therefore, what is the conclusion? Mindy is probably a good watchdog. There's a high probability, because most corgis are good watchdogs, that Mindy will be a good watchdog. And so we see that as an inductive argument that flows from a generalization. We need to, when evaluating generalizations, use the following criteria. So when you understand it's an inductive argument and you see that it's a generalization, you now have a process to analyze. And here are some of the 5 criteria that you need to use in analyzing an inductive argument. Number 1, you need to determine, are the premises true? Are those statements that lead to the conclusion actually verifiable? Are they true? Number 2, is the sample large enough? When we say most corgis are good watchdogs, how many corgis have we looked at, or how many corgi owners have we surveyed? If it's only 2, that's not a large enough sample, and so we can't then draw an inductive conclusion from that. But if we'd surveyed 5,000 corgi owners and 90% of them said that their corgi was a good watchdog, we could inductively assume that most corgis are good watchdogs. So is the sample large enough? And then we need to decide if the sample is representative of that type of animal, the corgi for instance. Is the sample current and up to date? We'll see this later on. There are many things that may have been assumed to be true or inductively assumed. As research continues and as we find new data, we find that perhaps what was assumed to be true before is not as true. And we need to decide whether the premises support the conclusion. And your textbook does a lot of work in helping you look at premises that do support the conclusion and premises that don't. The second part of an inductive argument is analogy. And in analogy, we have this great example of Tecumseh, who said that an alliance of tribes is like braided hair. A single strand is easy to break, but several strands braided together are almost impossible to break. So that's probably true, and so therefore it's an inductive argument, but it's using analogy. It's a statement of analogy. It is like this. A group of tribes banded together is like hair that is braided. It is stronger. So when looking at arguments from analogy, we analyze and we evaluate them with the following criteria. Number 1, we need to look at what is being compared. If I were to say that a group of tribes banded together is as strong as silk, is that a good comparison? So we need to identify what is being compared. We need to list the similarities. How is hair similar, or braided hair similar to a group of tribes gathering together, or a band of people gathering together to be stronger? We need to list the dissimilarities. How is hair unlike a group of people banding together? We need to compare these lists, the comparisons, the similarities and dissimilarities, and then we need to examine possible counter-analogies. What other ways can we describe this issue that's under analysis? And then we need to determine if the analogy supports the conclusion. So when we're dealing with arguments from analogy, those are the ways in which we can analyze and assess their strength or weakness. And then there are causal inductive arguments. A great example of this is the correlation between cigarettes smoked and lung cancer. Does smoking cigarettes cause lung cancer? Is there a causal relationship between smoking cigarettes and lung cancer? How many cigarettes do we need to smoke? What about the issue of secondhand smoke? And so there are all these issues in causation that we need to think about as we analyze causal arguments or inductive arguments that are causal in nature. So a causal argument is defined as an event that brings about a change or effect. In causal arguments, something is claimed as the cause of something else. Understanding cause and effect relations is a crucial component of effective critical thinking. How do we evaluate causal arguments? Just as we've evaluated arguments from analogy, and now we need to evaluate causal arguments. Knowing how to evaluate them makes it easier to employ them productively. And there are 4 criteria here. Number 1, determine whether evidence for a causal relationship is strong. So is there actually a relationship between how many cigarettes I smoke and lung cancer? How many people who have smoked cigarettes have lung cancer? And then what are the other variables that come into that? For instance, is a person who smokes a lot of cigarettes but working with asbestos? Is there a correlation between those two things, and does working with asbestos impact lung cancer? And so we need to really carefully determine whether the evidence for a causal relationship is strong, and also try to understand what other variables impact that relationship. We need to make sure that the argument is free of fallacies, and we've looked at formal and informal fallacies in a previous session. You can go back and look at those. But is the argument free of fallacies, ambiguity, sweeping statements, and so on that we've looked at? Decide whether the data is current and up to date. Is the data that you have current, or is it old data? There's always new findings that are occurring. And then make sure that the conclusion does not go beyond the premises. So to say that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer is fine, but to say that cigarette smoking is the only factor that causes lung cancer is to go beyond the premises that are presented. So when making decisions on the basis of causal arguments, such as whether to allow your children to sit close to a television, your information should be up to date. What was true at one time may no longer be the case. Why? Well, number 1, televisions have changed. We used to have tubes in our television, and they were small, and the way they put the picture together was very different. Now we have LCD screens, we have LED screens, and so perhaps sitting close is not as detrimental. Perhaps it's more detrimental. And so we need to ensure that our research is current and that we're up to date when analyzing an inductive argument and drawing conclusions. So in conclusion, I want to say to you, knowledge of inductive arguments, including generalizations, analogies, and causal arguments, is essential for us to effectively function in the world. We're continually analyzing arguments that are put forth to us as we make decisions. As good critical thinkers, we must constantly identify and evaluate inductive arguments, both our own and those presented to us by others. Thank you.